The cockpit trembled with the force of the dive. Wind howled against the canopy, drowning the roar of the Nakajima Sakai engine. The pilot's white headband clung to his sweat-drenched forehead, the rising sun emblem smeared with salt and grease. Below him, the blue expanse of the Pacific shimmered in the morning light, broken only by the dark silhouettes of warships clustered together in formation. His target loomed largest of all, a British aircraft carrier, its armored deck glinting like steel under the sun. He tightened his grip on the stick, heart pounding in rhythm with the engine's whine. For weeks he had trained for this moment. For months he had been told that one final sacrifice could turn the tide of war. He pressed the throttle forward. Gravity pulled him down, and the earth surged upward in a blur of horizon and sea. On the carrier below, sailors braced themselves. Some clutched fire hoses, others stood rigid at anti-aircraft stations, the barrels of Bofors and Oerlikons already spitting fire into the sky. Men on the flight deck paused only for a heartbeat, enough to glimpse the descending shadow, wings fixed in its fatal plunge, before they ducked behind barriers or threw themselves flat against the armored steel. The Zero came screaming down, faster, closer, unstoppable. And then, impact. The explosion tore across the flight deck, a blinding flash of fire and twisted wreckage. For a moment the ship seemed swallowed in smoke and flame, but as the haze drifted, the truth became clear. The carrier still held steady in the water. Its deck, though scarred and scorched, had not buckled. Fire crews sprang into action, extinguishing burning fuel in minutes. Planes still stood ready, crews still at their posts. The ship had endured. Where Japanese planners had expected devastation, steel melted, fuel ignited, hangars torn open, they found resilience. Against sacrifice, Britain had built survival. This was April 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa. By then, the war in the Pacific had reached its most desperate stage. For Japan, the once victorious empire that had struck at Pearl Harbor and swept across Asia, options were dwindling. American submarines strangled their supply lines, bombers reduced their cities to ashes, and carriers ranged freely across once guarded waters. But one weapon remained, born from desperation and nationalist fervor: the kamikaze. These were no longer traditional pilots. Many were barely trained aviators, handed a plane packed with fuel and explosives, and ordered to die in service to the emperor. They flew with the expectation that even one successful strike could cripple a carrier, kill hundreds, and stall the Allied advance. In their minds, American and British carriers were Achilles' heels, vast floating air bases vulnerable to fire and chaos. They were told that a single human bomb could shatter the industrial giants aligned against them. And for a time, against American wooden-decked carriers, that belief seemed true. Off Leyte Gulf, kamikazes had plunged into U.S. carriers and left them ablaze. Decks ripped open, crews fighting flames for days. Hundreds of sailors perished in those sudden infernos. Japan's new tactic shocked the Allies, who now faced not just combat, but the terrifying certainty of opponents intent on death. Yet when the British fleet joined the fight in the Pacific in 1945, the kamikazes found an unexpected opponent. Unlike their American counterparts, the Royal Navy's fleet carriers bore armored flight decks, thick layers of hardened steel designed to absorb punishment. Born from the lessons of the Mediterranean, where dive bombers and torpedoes had threatened ships at every turn, British engineers had sacrificed aircraft capacity for resilience. Critics once argued that these carriers carried too few planes to matter. But in the crucible of Okinawa, the gamble paid off. Each kamikaze that struck British carriers, illustrious, indomitable, victorious, formidable, did damage, but rarely decisive. Planes gouged craters in the decks, engines and fuel tanks scattered in fiery ruin. Yet the steel beneath held. Fire crews doused flames quickly. Damage control parties patched and welded. Within hours, sometimes minutes, flight operations resumed. Time and again, Japanese pilots gave their lives in vain, only to see the ships they targeted still afloat, still launching sorties, still pushing the fleet forward. For the men aboard, it was a revelation. Survivors recalled hearing the impact reverberate through the hull like thunder, then rising to their feet to find the deck intact. Sailors who might have expected death by fire instead found themselves scrambling to hose down wreckage, drag twisted metal clear, and return to duty. They saw firsthand the contrast between sacrifice and survival, between desperation and design. And for the Japanese pilots who aimed their final dives at these carriers, the result was equally shocking. Where they expected the glory of destruction, they met only futility. Their sacrifice, sanctified by ritual and national myth, achieved little beyond twisted wreckage scattered across the steel surface of an enemy that refused to break. This was the opening note of one of the Pacific War's final, brutal chapters. The Battle of Okinawa would see the largest concentration of kamikaze attacks in history, thousands of planes hurled against Allied fleets. Yet it was here that the stark difference between American and British carrier design became undeniable. Armored decks did not make the British invulnerable, but they blunted the spear of Japan's last weapon. The lesson was immediate and visceral. Courage and sacrifice alone could not overturn industrial might, nor defeat engineering built for endurance. In the final months of the Pacific War, as kamikaze pilots dove with cries of "Banzai" and the steel decks held firm, the fate of empires was decided not just by valor or ideology, but by rivets, steel, and the cold logic of design. The smoke cleared over Okinawa's waters, and the world would remember the moment. Kamikazes had met their match, and Japanese shock was the prelude to collapse. The young pilot knelt on the tatami mat, brush in hand, the ink still glistening as he signed his farewell letter. Outside, cicadas droned in the humid Kyushu air, their endless cries filling the quiet training barracks. The letter was simple: gratitude to his parents, loyalty to the emperor, a promise to give his life for Japan. Around him, his comrades were doing the same, each stroke of the brush committing their names to a fate already sealed. When the letter was finished, he folded it carefully, tucking it into an envelope marked for home. In a few days, his body would no longer exist. Only the letter would remain, arriving at his family's door long after the plane he flew had burned into the sea. By 1944, Japan had reached a point of desperation that made such rituals necessary. The empire that had swept across Asia and the Pacific in a storm of victories was now pressed back on every front. At sea, the Imperial Navy had been broken by the crushing defeats of Midway and the Philippine Sea. In the air, Japan's finest pilots, the elite men trained for years in rigorous programs, were gone, replaced by hastily trained youths barely able to handle their aircraft. On land, American forces pushed closer with every campaign: Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu. Each loss brought the enemy closer to Japan's home islands, each loss tightening the noose around the empire's throat. Factories that once produced aircraft and engines in quantity now struggled to function. American B-29 bombers pounded industrial centers day and night, crippling production and scattering workers. Fuel, the lifeblood of any modern war machine, had become scarce. The South Pacific oil fields were gone, cut off by Allied advances and submarines that prowled Japan's supply lines. Planes could be built, but training sorties were reduced, engines left idle, wings grounded for want of aviation fuel. Japan's war planners faced a grim equation. They could not outproduce America. They could not outtrain America. They could not replace their losses as quickly as the Allies could. It was in this crucible of defeat that the idea of the kamikaze was born. The concept was deceptively simple. If Japan could not match the Allies plane for plane, then they would turn the aircraft themselves into weapons. A pilot, stripped of the expectation of survival, would crash his plane deliberately into an enemy ship. The plane would become a guided missile, the pilot its fuse. The idea was not without precedent. Throughout history, there had been instances of soldiers sacrificing themselves in last, desperate attacks. Ships rammed in ancient battles, grenades clutched to the chest in modern wars. Even during the early Pacific campaigns, isolated pilots had occasionally chosen to crash their disabled aircraft into enemy ships rather than bail out. But in 1944, this impulse became a deliberate doctrine. Suicide was systematized, organized, and elevated into strategy. The Imperial Japanese Navy first tested the idea during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed the formation of special attack units. His reasoning was blunt. Japan's conventional forces were no longer capable of halting the American advance. Only a new, more desperate weapon could delay the inevitable. A Zero fighter, carrying a single 250-kilogram bomb, could be more effective as a suicide weapon than in a dogfight it was certain to lose. In Onishi's words, "There is no other way to stop the enemy." To the Japanese public and to the young men who would fly these missions, the attacks were wrapped in the language of honor and divinity. The term itself, kamikaze, divine wind, was a direct reference to the typhoons that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries earlier. Now, the pilots were cast as a living storm, modern samurai sacrificing themselves to protect the homeland. Propaganda films and posters exalted their bravery. Teachers encouraged students to volunteer. Newspapers carried tales of men who had gone joyfully to their deaths, smiling as they launched into the sky. But beneath the myth lay harsher truths. Many of the men selected for kamikaze duty were barely trained, with only a handful of flight hours before being assigned to their missions. Some volunteered willingly, convinced by the culture of sacrifice and loyalty that had shaped their education since childhood. Others were pressured, their refusal interpreted as cowardice, their honor at risk. The line between choice and coercion blurred in a society where dissent carried shame not just for the individual, but for their entire family. The aircraft themselves reflected the desperation of the moment. Zeros and other fighters were stripped down, packed with explosives, and given just enough fuel for a one-way flight. In some cases, specially designed planes such as the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, nicknamed Baka Bomb by the Americans, were built specifically for suicide missions. Essentially manned rockets, the Oka could reach speeds too fast for Allied fighters to intercept, but only if carried close to the target by a bomber. Many were destroyed before they could be launched. Still, the mere existence of these weapons illustrated how far Japan had descended into the logic of self-destruction. Inside the barracks, rituals gave shape to what lay ahead. Pilots drank sake before boarding, shared their last cigarettes, tied white headbands around their foreheads. They were photographed in ceremonial poses, presented with tokens of honor, handed the final letters that would reach their families. Some wept in private. Others tried to remain stoic. A few scrawled last-minute graffiti onto the walls of their quarters, leaving behind fragments of themselves, and then they flew. Over Okinawa, over the Philippines, over the waters where the Allied fleets advanced, hundreds of young men turned their planes into flaming spears. The first waves caught the Allies by surprise, sinking escorts and crippling carriers. American sailors described the horror of watching planes deliberately slam into their decks, the sky filled with burning wreckage, the sea littered with oil and bodies. For a brief time, the kamikazes seemed like a weapon that might alter the course of the war. But even in its earliest successes, the arithmetic of the kamikaze was flawed. Each mission required the life of a pilot, the construction of a plane, and the precious reserves of fuel to send it into the sky. Each loss was irreplaceable for Japan, and the Allies, with their vast resources, learned quickly. Radar picket ships were deployed to detect incoming planes. Combat air patrols intercepted many before they reached their targets. Anti-aircraft gunners filled the skies with steel. By the spring of 1945, the kamikazes were being spent faster than they could inflict damage. their sacrifice buying only temporary delay at an unsustainable cost. For Japan, however, the tactic became the last weapon available. It was not born of strength, but of weakness, of a nation backed into a corner, seeking salvation in the deaths of its sons. To the young men who flew these missions, the kamikaze was framed as the highest honor, but in reality, it was the ultimate symbol of a war already lost. And when these human bombs turned their sights on the British carriers in 1945, the expectation of devastation clashed head-on with the reality of armored decks. The Empire's last gamble, born of desperation and sacrifice, would find itself tested against steel designed not for glory, but for endurance. The fog lifted slowly over the River Clyde, revealing the colossal outline of a ship taking shape in the gray Scottish dawn. Sparks rained from welders' torches. Steel plates groaned as they were lowered into place, and the air was filled with the clang of hammers on rivets. Men in oil-stained overalls moved like ants across the hull, their breath hanging in the cold morning air. This was no ordinary vessel. Its flight deck was not made of wood, but of armor, great slabs of Sheffield steel, thick enough to resist the heaviest bombs, welded together to form a fortress that would sail on the sea. It was a new kind of aircraft carrier, born of Britain's unique war and the bitter lessons of the Mediterranean. When the Second World War began in 1939, Britain's naval strategists faced a dilemma. They had studied the rapid development of naval aviation in the interwar years, watching the United States experiment with fast carriers and Japan perfect the art of massed aerial strike. But Britain's strategic environment was not the open Pacific. It was the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the narrow Mediterranean, where enemy aircraft could appear with little warning and where land-based bombers posed as great a threat as naval ones. In these confined waters, survival depended not only on the striking power of a carrier's air group, but on its ability to endure punishment. Thus, while American designers emphasized numbers, producing carriers that could carry vast air wings on expansive wooden flight decks, the British adopted a different philosophy. Their carriers would be smaller, their hangars more compact, and their air groups limited. But the ships themselves would be armored citadels, able to shrug off direct hits and continue the fight. This divergence reflected not only geography, but also industry. Britain's shipyards, concentrated along the Clyde, the Tyne, and the Mersey, were accustomed to building heavily armored warships. They had produced battleships for generations. Constructing carriers with thick steel decks was a natural extension of that tradition. The armored flight deck was both an innovation and a gamble. On paper, it promised survival. A steel deck could absorb the impact of bombs that would otherwise punch through wood, ignite aviation fuel, and set entire hangars ablaze. Yet this protection came at a cost. Armored decks were heavy. To maintain stability, designers had to reduce the size of hangars beneath the deck. That meant fewer aircraft could be carried, and in the calculus of naval aviation, fewer planes often meant less striking power. Critics argued that Britain was sacrificing offense for defense, producing carriers that might endure but could not deliver decisive blows. Nevertheless, Britain pressed forward. The illustrious class carriers, laid down in the late 1930s, embodied this doctrine. HMS Illustrious, HMS Formidable, HMS Victorious, and later HMS Indomitable were all built with armored decks that were up to 3 inches thick in places. The steel came from Sheffield's foundries, a city whose mills had long produced the armor plate for Britain's navy. In the factories, women and men worked side by side, rolling and tempering steel in furnaces that glowed like suns, producing the plates that would be welded into decks capable of withstanding hellfire. The test came early. In January 1941, HMS Illustrious was operating in the Mediterranean when German dive bombers of the Luftwaffe launched a ferocious assault. Waves of Ju-87 Stukas plunged from the sky, their sirens screaming, dropping armor-piercing bombs that smashed onto the flight deck. The impact was devastating. Great craters were gouged into the steel, planes parked on deck were destroyed, and fires raged. Yet when the smoke cleared, Illustrious was still afloat. Her armored deck had absorbed the punishment. She limped into Malta, battered but alive, and sailors across the fleet realized that without the steel deck, she would have been lost. This moment confirmed the British doctrine. Survival was worth the trade-off. If a carrier could withstand a direct hit and remain operational, it mattered less how many planes it carried. In the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where enemy bombers could swarm with little warning, this resilience allowed the Royal Navy to keep its carriers in action when a wooden deck might have meant destruction. The Americans took note, but their own doctrine diverged for practical reasons. The United States possessed vast industrial capacity. American shipyards could produce carriers in numbers Britain could only dream of, and the Pacific theater demanded offensive strength above all. If a carrier was damaged, another could take its place. Wooden decks allowed larger air groups, and for the U.S. Navy, quantity was a form of protection in itself. Britain, by contrast, had no such luxury. It needed ships that could endure, not simply be replaced. The industrial effort behind these armored carriers was immense. In the Clyde shipyards, thousands of workers labored under constant pressure, often under the shadow of German bombing raids. At night, the yards were cloaked in blackout, the glow of furnaces hidden, while workers continued their shifts in near darkness. Women entered the yards in unprecedented numbers, welding, riveting, and assembling sections of carriers that would soon sail into war. Each ship represented millions of man-hours, thousands of tons of steel, and a faith in survival as strategy. By the time Britain's armored carriers reached the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, they carried with them this legacy. Their hangars were smaller than those of their American allies, and their air groups fewer in number, but their decks were shields of steel. For sailors who had endured the Luftwaffe's wrath in the Mediterranean, the Kamikazes of Okinawa would feel like an echo of earlier trials. Only now, the stakes were global. The doctrine of armored decks was more than just engineering. It was a reflection of Britain's wartime reality, a nation fighting for survival with limited resources, determined to build ships that could withstand punishment rather than rely on rapid replacement. Where the Americans wagered on numbers, Britain wagered on resilience. And as 1945 approached, this difference in philosophy would collide with Japan's last weapon, the kamikaze. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the courage of men, but the endurance of steel. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath a burning sun, a mirror of blue broken only by the specks of warships that seemed to crawl across its vastness. On the horizon, new shapes appeared, their outlines different from the American carriers already dominating the ocean. Their decks looked smaller, their silhouettes more compact, but their hulls exuded a certain defiance. These were the carriers of the British Pacific Fleet, steel-plated fortresses arriving late to the war's greatest stage. Their decks bore scars from earlier battles in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, yet now they steamed into the Pacific in 1944, ready to join the Allies for the final act against Japan. For the sailors who had crossed half the world to reach these waters, the transition was dramatic. Gone were the narrow seas of Europe, the rocky coasts of Norway, and the confined battlegrounds of the Mediterranean. Ahead lay the Pacific, a theater defined by distance, typhoons and islands scattered like stepping stones across thousands of miles. Supplies had to be shipped across oceans, fuel tankers kept the fleet alive, and every strike demanded coordination with the far larger and more experienced U.S. Navy. The British fleet was not the dominant partner here. Instead, it was a critical reinforcement, a symbol of solidarity, and a chance to prove that its armored doctrine could stand the test of Japan's most desperate weapon. Japanese reconnaissance flights shadowed the Allied fleets, their cameras and radios reporting back to commanders on the strange newcomers. They noted that British carriers carried fewer aircraft than the massive Essex-class carriers of the Americans. Aboard U.S. decks, over 90 planes could be mustered for a strike. Aboard a British armored carrier, often fewer than 50 could be launched. To Japanese planners, it seemed a weakness to exploit. They assumed that fewer planes meant less striking power, and that a single determined kamikaze could do as much damage to a British ship as to an American one. What they could not see from their distant vantage points was the secret hidden in the steel of the decks, an armor that would soon change the equation. The baptism of fire came quickly. In the early months of 1945, as the Allies closed in on the Japanese home islands, British carriers began to operate alongside American task forces. They struck at oil refineries, airfields, and coastal targets, their aircraft roaring from steel decks into the tropical skies. But soon enough, the kamikazes came. Japanese planes dived not only at the familiar wooden expanses of U.S. carriers, but also at the smaller British decks that now bristled with anti-aircraft guns. The contrast became evident in those first encounters. On American carriers, a successful kamikaze strike could be catastrophic. A plane plunging into the flight deck could ignite fuel, detonate bombs, and set hangars ablaze. Deck planking splintered, steel frames buckled, and black smoke poured skyward. Some ships burned for hours. Others were knocked out of action for weeks. Sailors fought fires with desperation, knowing that a single delayed response could mean the loss of ship and crew. On the British carriers, the same scene played out differently. When a kamikaze smashed into HMS Formidable, the explosion tore across the deck, scattering wreckage and killing men at their stations. Yet when the smoke cleared, the deck itself was intact. The armor had absorbed the impact. Craters dented the surface but did not penetrate. Fires, though fierce, were confined and extinguished quickly. Within hours, planes were once again being launched from the scarred steel, the ship still very much in the fight. For the sailors who lived through it, the realization was almost surreal. They had expected annihilation, to be consumed by fire like their American counterparts often were. Instead, they found themselves dragging wreckage clear and resuming their duties. The shock of survival lingered long after the flames were put out. Sailors began to call their ships unsinkable flat tops, a name that spread through the fleet like a badge of honor. The Americans, too, took notice. While their carriers relied on speed, mass, and the sheer scale of their industrial production, the British ships demonstrated a different philosophy. They were harder to kill, designed to endure punishment, in a way that made even the kamikaze seem less terrifying. To American eyes, the trade-off was striking. Fewer planes, but greater resilience. In the crucible of the Pacific, both doctrines had value. The British proved especially useful in the dangerous work of raiding airfields and drawing the brunt of kamikaze attacks, knowing their armored decks could survive blows that might cripple an American carrier. This first blood in the Pacific established the reputation of Britain's armored carriers. They would never rival the Americans in scale or numbers, but they had shown that survival itself was a form of power. Every kamikaze that struck and failed to sink them weakened Japan further, draining pilots, planes, and fuel in exchange for little more than scorch marks and dents. For the British sailors who watched Zeros plunge from the sky only to see their ship remain afloat, it was both a testament to engineering and a grim reminder of the human cost on the other side. The Pacific was unforgiving, and these early encounters proved that the British carriers were ready for what was to come. The kamikazes had tested their strength, and the armor had held. Yet the storm was only beginning. Ahead lay Okinawa, the largest and deadliest campaign of the Pacific War, where hundreds of kamikazes would hurl themselves at the Allied fleets. The British armored decks had survived their first trial, but the true test was still waiting. A storm of fire and sacrifice on a scale the world had never seen. The sparks cascaded like fiery rain as the welder's torch carved a line through the steel. The shipyard floor rumbled with the groan of cranes hauling armor plate into place, each slab weighing tons, each destined to become part of something greater than the men who handled it. Inside the foundries of Sheffield, white-hot ingots glowed in the furnace light, hammered and rolled into sheets thicker than a man's arm. The heat was suffocating. Sweat poured down soot-blackened faces, and yet the rhythm of hammer, press, and torch continued without pause. Every plate of armor, every welded seam was more than just steel. It was survival, forged for carriers that would face firestorms at sea. From the very beginning, the British approach to carrier construction was rooted in engineering decisions made long before the Pacific Campaign. The armored flight deck was no accident. It was the result of years of planning, design, and sacrifice. Naval architects in the late 1930s studied the vulnerabilities of existing carriers. Wooden flight decks, favored for their lighter weight, could carry more planes, but they were also vulnerable tinderboxes. One well-placed bomb could penetrate the planks, ignite aviation fuel stored below, and create an inferno that consumed ship and crew alike. The solution Britain chose was radical: armor the deck itself, turning the carrier from a floating airfield into an armored citadel. The metallurgy behind this decision was as vital as any battlefield tactic. Sheffield's steel mills, already famous for producing armor plate for battleships, adapted their techniques to create flight decks capable of absorbing direct hits. These plates, often 2 to 3 inches thick, were tempered to balance hardness with flexibility. Too brittle, and they would shatter under impact. Too soft, and they would bend and buckle. The result was a carefully engineered compromise: armor that could deflect bombs, withstand shock, and remain serviceable even after violent strikes. Welding techniques were equally critical. Earlier warships had been built largely with riveted construction, but riveting created weak points where explosions could split seams. By the late 1930s, British shipyards embraced welding on a massive scale. Welded joints fused steel plates into continuous surfaces, distributing the energy of impacts more evenly across the structure. In the shipyards of the Clyde and Tyne, teams of welders worked day and night, their arcs illuminating the darkness, their craftsmanship hidden beneath layers of armor that would one day face kamikazes head-on. Compartmentalization was another secret to survival. Beneath the armored deck, British carriers were divided into carefully sealed sections. Aviation fuel was stored in armored tanks, isolated and vented to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire. Hangars were subdivided by armored bulkheads and equipped with powerful fire doors. Ventilation systems were designed to expel smoke rapidly, keeping compartments breathable during firefighting efforts. Damage control was not an afterthought. It was designed into the very bones of the ship. The difference between British and American carriers became clear when disaster struck. Imagine the scene aboard a wooden-decked carrier hit by a kamikaze. The plane smashes into the planking, its bomb tearing through to the hangar below. Aviation fuel erupts in a fireball, flames race through the open hangar, and bombs stacked for the next sortie cook off in secondary explosions. Men are trapped below, fire spreads uncontrollably, and the ship is left crippled, if not lost entirely. By contrast, when a kamikaze struck a British armored deck, the explosion blasted outward, scattering wreckage, but the steel held. Fires were confined to the deck itself, fuel tanks remained sealed, and damage control teams had the inferno under control within minutes. Planes might be destroyed, lives lost, but the ship itself remained an active fighting unit. For the men who built these carriers, the connection between factory floor and battlefront was deeply personal. Letters from sailors filtered back to the industrial cities, describing how armored decks had saved lives. Workers who once thought of their shifts as endless monotony now understood that every weld might mean the difference between a ship's survival and her destruction. In Sheffield, women rolling armor plate whispered prayers over the steel, believing it would shield their brothers and sons overseas. In the Clyde yards, welders scrawled their initials on beams, marks hidden forever inside hulls that would sail across the world. This engineering effort demanded sacrifices. The armored carriers carried fewer planes, sometimes half as many as an American Essex-class carrier. Pilots grumbled at the cramped hangars, and admirals worried about the reduced striking power. But in the Pacific, where kamikazes hurled themselves against fleets in numbers unseen before, those design choices proved decisive. A British carrier might launch fewer sorties, but it could endure repeated attacks without leaving the line. A ship that stayed afloat was worth more than one temporarily boasting a larger air group. The difference could be measured in cold statistics. By war's end, not a single British armored carrier was lost to kamikaze attacks. Many were struck, formidable, illustrious, indomitable, and others bore scars across their decks, but all survived. Fires were extinguished, dents were hammered flat, and the decks were patched with steel plates bolted over the craters. Some ships resumed flight operations within hours of being hit, a feat almost unthinkable for carriers with wooden decks. Survivors often spoke of the sound of impact, the way the entire ship shook like a bell struck by a hammer. They described the roar of flames, the sudden darkness as smoke choked compartments, and the deafening silence when the fires were finally out. They remembered dragging charred wreckage off the flight deck, only to see new planes wheeled forward minutes later. For them, the armored deck was not just a design choice, it was the shield that had kept them alive. In the end, the science of armored decks was more than metallurgy and welding. It was a philosophy of survival. Britain had built carriers not as symbols of offensive might, but as fortresses of steel that could endure the worst the enemy could throw at them. In the Pacific, as kamikazes hurled themselves against these floating citadels, that philosophy proved its worth. But survival at sea came at a terrible price. Every kamikaze that shattered against a steel deck represented a young life spent in vain, a sacrifice turned futile by engineering choices made years earlier in distant factories. And as the British fleet pressed onward, the contrast between the desperation of Japan's human weapons and the endurance of Britain's armored carriers would grow sharper still. The storm of Okinawa was coming, and the decks of steel would soon face their greatest trial. The sea around Okinawa was deceptively calm that April morning, a sheet of blue stretched under a pale spring sky. Aboard HMS Formidable, sailors went about their routines, loading ammunition belts, checking fire hoses, and readying aircraft for the day's strikes. The horizon shimmered with the silhouettes of hundreds of Allied warships, the largest armada assembled since Normandy. Yet beneath the surface calm, tension gripped every man. They all knew what was coming. Radar screens flickered. Spotters scanned the sky. Somewhere beyond the clouds, Japan was preparing to unleash its last, most desperate weapon. Then the sirens wailed. Radar stations picked up the blips, dozens of them, fast-moving, converging from multiple directions. Pilots scrambled to intercept. Gunners swung their weapons skyward, and the fleet braced for impact. Moments later, the sky was filled with the banshee wail of descending engines. Kamikazes had arrived. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, was unlike any campaign before it. The island was the last stepping stone to Japan itself, and the Imperial Command had resolved to defend it with unprecedented ferocity. Unable to match the Allies in conventional air combat, Japan deployed its kamikaze forces in massive waves. Between April and June 1945, more than 1,500 suicide aircraft were hurled against the Allied fleets. They came in swarms, often coordinated with conventional raids, their only mission to die and fire against the decks of Allied carriers and battleships. The American fleet bore the brunt of these attacks, but alongside it fought Britain's Task Force 57, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, and their escorts. Their mission was to neutralize Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands, preventing reinforcements from reaching Okinawa. It was a thankless, grueling assignment. Every day, their aircraft flew sorties to crater runways and strafe dispersal zones. Every night, Japanese crews patched the damage, and by morning the kamikazes returned. The cycle was endless, and the pressure unrelenting. Eyewitnesses remembered the sensory overload of the attacks. The scream of engines as Japanese planes dove from the sun. The thunder of anti-aircraft guns hammering in unison. The acrid stench of cordite, smoke, and burning aviation fuel. Sailors described how time seemed to slow in those moments, watching a kamikaze grow larger in the sky, tracing its path as it evaded flak and fighters, before slamming into the deck in a blinding flash. The shockwave knocked men off their feet, ears ringing, vision blurred. Yet when the smoke lifted, the armored decks told a different story. On May 4, 1945, HMS Formidable was struck by a Zero carrying a 500-kilogram bomb. The plane smashed into her flight deck, detonating with a blast that killed dozens and wounded many more. The explosion tore open a crater 24 feet wide, scattering wreckage across the deck. For a moment, it seemed the ship might be out of action. Yet the armored plating had absorbed the worst of the impact. Fires were contained, aviation fuel tanks remained sealed, and within hours, the crew had patched the hole with steel plates. That same afternoon, aircraft were again being launched from her deck. A ship that should have been crippled for weeks was back in the fight in a single day. This was the pattern repeated across the British carriers. HMS Indomitable took hits from suicide planes that scorched her deck and destroyed parked aircraft, but her armored surface held. HMS Victorious endured kamikaze strikes that might have gutted a wooden-decked carrier, but her structure absorbed the blow. Again and again, Japanese pilots gave their lives only to see their sacrifices turn to ash against steel. The resilience stunned those who witnessed it. American sailors, accustomed to seeing their carriers burning fiercely after hits, marveled at how quickly the British ships returned to duty. To them, the British carriers seemed unsinkable, their steel decks a kind of talisman against destruction. For the men aboard, the knowledge that their ship could take such punishment and survive was a source of grim confidence. They mourned their dead, patched the scars, and carried on, knowing that their fortress-like carriers would not fail them easily. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was devastating. Kamikaze pilots had been told their sacrifice would cripple the enemy, that one life could buy the destruction of a mighty carrier. But when their comrades' fiery dives left only scorch marks on British decks, doubt spread even in the ranks of those prepared to die. The divine wind had met immovable steel, and faith alone could not shatter it. The statistics bore out the reality. During Operation Iceberg, British Task Force 57 was hit by more than a dozen kamikaze attacks. None of its carriers were sunk. None were put permanently out of action. The casualties were heavy. Sailors were burned, battered, and buried at sea, but the ships endured. They remained on station, launching sorties day after day, their presence a constant reminder that Japan's last weapon was being blunted. Life aboard during those weeks was a relentless grind. Sailors stood at their posts for hours, eyes scanning the skies, nerves stretched thin by the constant threat of attack. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the wail of alarms and the crash of impacts. Damage control drills became second nature, fire hoses and extinguishers always at the ready. Mess halls doubled as first aid stations, where wounded men were treated beside steaming pots of tea. The camaraderie of survival bound the crews together. Every man knew he was part of a floating fortress, and every man trusted the steel under his boots. Operation Iceberg dragged on for nearly 3 months, and by its end, the seas around Okinawa were littered with the wreckage of kamikaze planes. Japan had spent its air strength in a storm of sacrifice, losing over 7,000 aircraft in the campaign. The Allies, though battered, had prevailed. For Britain's carriers, the ordeal became proof of concept. Their armored decks had justified every ton of steel, every sacrifice of aircraft capacity, every long hour in the shipyards. Yet survival carried its own weight. Sailors never forgot the faces of comrades killed in the blasts, the sudden void where friends had stood moments before. Survivors of Formidable spoke of the silence that followed the all-clear, when the guns ceased and the fires were out, and only the smell of burnt metal and flesh lingered. Victory had been purchased not only with engineering, but with blood. As the British fleet steamed away from Okinawa, its decks scarred but intact, the lesson was clear. Japan's most desperate gamble had failed against the resilience of steel. But the cost of that failure was measured in thousands of young pilots who had died in vain, and in the grief of families who would never see them return. The storm at Okinawa was not only a clash of weapons, it was a collision of philosophies, sacrifice against survival, belief against engineering, and in that collision, the future of naval warfare was decided. The young pilot's diary ended abruptly. His last entry, scribbled in pencil the night before his mission, was simple. "Tomorrow, I will become a shining jewel for the Emperor. May my body be a blade to pierce the enemy's ship." His plane never returned. Japanese records later confirmed what Allied sailors already knew. He had struck a British carrier during the Okinawa campaign. Yet the carrier had not sunk, had not even been forced out of action. Instead, the steel deck absorbed the blow, the fires were extinguished, and sorties resumed within hours. The sacrifice that had seemed so absolute ended not with triumph, but with futility. For Japan's pilots, and for their commanders, the shock was profound. In the final months of the war, Kamikaze doctrine had been built upon faith as much as tactics. Leaders told their pilots that a single human life could equal a warship. Propaganda exalted the notion that courage and sacrifice could compensate for dwindling resources and collapsing industry. And at first, evidence seemed to support it. American carriers hit off the Philippines often burned for days. Bombs detonated beneath wooden decks, igniting aviation fuel and setting hangars ablaze. Thousands of American sailors were killed or wounded by kamikaze strikes, their ships left crippled or forced into months of repair. Japanese commanders monitoring these effects convinced themselves that the kamikaze could hold back the Allied tide. But when their pilots turned their sights on the British carriers, the outcome was startlingly different. Reports filtered back of planes diving directly into decks, of bombs detonating with perfect accuracy, and yet, time and again, the carriers continued operating. Crews launched new sorties within hours of impact. Fires were contained, damage patched, decks scarred but unbroken. Japanese reconnaissance confirmed it. The British carriers were surviving what should have been fatal strikes. For the pilots who volunteered in their thousands, this truth was unbearable. Survivors from escort missions recalled the disbelief among those chosen for kamikaze duty when they learned that British iron decks resisted their sacrifice. Men had gone to their deaths believing they would strike decisive blows, only for their comrades to discover the enemy remained afloat. In the barracks, whispers spread that crashing into a British carrier was useless, that no matter how fiercely they burned, the enemy's ships endured. To admit this was dangerous, almost treasonous, but the knowledge spread nonetheless. Among Japan's naval staff, frustration boiled. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who oversaw many of the kamikaze operations, lamented in his diary that British carriers withstood punishment that crippled the Americans. Other officers recognized the cause: industrial design. Britain's armored decks, born from years of fighting the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean, had prepared them for exactly this kind of attack. Valor could not penetrate steel. Sacrifice could not overcome metallurgy. By the spring of 1945, some within Japan's high command realized that the kamikaze had already failed as a strategy, even as they continued to send young men to their deaths. Post-war interrogations revealed the depth of this disillusionment. Captured pilots and ground crew described the psychological toll. Some admitted they felt betrayed, that their leaders had asked them to die for a tactic that no longer worked. Others clung to the myth, insisting that their sacrifice still had meaning, even if it did not sink ships. Historians later noted how the contradiction between expectation and reality marked a quiet but significant psychological defeat for Japan. The divine wind had been blunted not by numbers, but by design choices made years earlier in British shipyards. The contrast with American carriers deepened the sense of futility. Japanese planners had expected both Allied navies to be equally vulnerable. Yet while American Essex-class carriers suffered heavily, often burning after hits, the British Illustrious class seemed unkillable. This uneven result created confusion and resentment. Why should the same sacrifice destroy one fleet's carriers while leaving another's nearly unscathed? The answer was brutally simple: steel armor, welding techniques, and compartmentalization. But for men steeped in a culture of spiritual valor, it was a bitter truth to accept that engineering, not heroism, determined survival. The impact of this realization rippled outward. Within Japan, morale crumbled as word of endless sacrifice without result filtered back from the front. Pilots still lined up to volunteer, driven by duty, coercion, or the desire to uphold family honor. But in private, some questioned the purpose. Their lives were being spent not to cripple the enemy, but to scar decks that would be patched within hours. For Japan's leaders, there was no turning back. With fuel gone, industry shattered, and air power depleted, the Kamikaze remained their only weapon. They pressed the attacks despite mounting evidence of failure. By June 1945, thousands of young men had perished in flames, while the Allied fleets remained afloat, their advance unstoppable. The gap between the sacrifice demanded and the results achieved grew into a chasm that could not be bridged. Historians today view this moment as a turning point, not because the armored decks won the war outright, but because they symbolized the futility of Japan's last gamble. The Kamikaze had been meant to terrify, to cripple, to buy time for a nation under siege. Instead, their failure against British carriers revealed that no amount of human sacrifice could reverse the material realities of the war. Steel and industry, not spirit and death, were the deciding factors. The psychological weight of this failure was immense. By the summer of 1945, Japan's skies were emptying, its pilots gone, its factories silent. The empire had asked its sons to become human weapons, and they had obeyed. But the enemy's ships remained, scarred, battered, yet unbroken. The realization cut deeper than any bomb. The final measure of courage had been spent, and it had not been enough. And still, the attacks continued. Even as leaders recognized the futility, planes launched into the skies, young men sang their farewell songs, and families wept at home. It was the ultimate tragedy of the Kamikaze, that the men who gave everything were undone not by weakness, but by steel. Their sacrifice marked not victory, but the slow, inevitable unraveling of the empire they sought to save. The sun beat down mercilessly on the steel decks of Task Force 57 as the spring of 1945 gave way to summer. Sailors worked stripped to the waist, their backs glistening with sweat, their ears deafened by the roar of engines as Seafires, Corsairs, and Avengers clawed into the sky. The armored decks still bore the scars of Kamikaze impacts, cratered steel patched over with bolted plates, but the ships remained fully operational. Smoke from the burning Sakishima airfields, cratered again and again by British strikes, drifted on the horizon. Yet even as their targets burned, the threat never vanished. Each dawn brought the possibility of another desperate assault, another Zero plunging from the sun, another test of men and metal. The role of the British Pacific Fleet was brutal in its monotony. For weeks on end, their aircraft were tasked with suppressing Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands and on Formosa. These bases were critical staging points for kamikaze squadrons, and as long as they remained functional, the Allied fleets at Okinawa could expect wave after wave of suicide strikes. British planes launched sorties in relentless succession, bombing runways, strafing dispersal areas, destroying aircraft on the ground. Yet each night, Japanese ground crews worked feverishly under cover of darkness, filling craters, repairing strips, and readying planes for dawn. It was a war of attrition measured in broken runways, shattered hangars, and the exhaustion of men on both sides. For the crews aboard the carriers, the grind was unrelenting. Damage control remained a constant duty. Every kamikaze hit, even when blunted by steel decks, left devastation in its wake. Fires to extinguish, wreckage to clear, blood to wash away before the next wave of planes could be launched. Teams drilled endlessly, practicing responses until they could move almost by instinct. Bulkheads were sealed in seconds, hoses deployed, and wounded carried below to hastily converted sick bays. Many sailors later recalled that it was this training, drilled into them in quiet harbors years before, that saved their lives when firestorms swept across the decks. Engineering foresight had given them armored decks. Discipline and training ensured those decks remained usable. The Japanese, meanwhile, were being bled dry. Every kamikaze that hurled itself against the Allied fleets represented a pilot who could never be replaced. By April 1945, Japan's once elite aviators were long gone, lost in earlier battles. Many of the kamikaze pilots at Okinawa were barely trained, some with only a handful of flight hours before being sent to their deaths. Planes were outdated models, patched together from spare parts or pulled from training units. Worse still, Japan's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Tankers had been sunk, oil fields in the Dutch East Indies recaptured, and synthetic production could not meet demand. Pilots often flew with just enough fuel to reach the target and crash, their planes essentially one-way coffins even before they began their final dive. The numbers tell the story of collapse. During the Battle of Okinawa, Japan lost more than 7,000 aircraft in defense of the island. Of these, thousands were kamikazes, each representing not only a lost plane but a lost pilot. The return on this investment was increasingly small. British carriers remained afloat. American carriers, though damaged, were repaired and returned to service. For every Allied ship struck, dozens of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The arithmetic of sacrifice no longer added up, and yet the attacks did not stop. Day after day, the British fleet endured raids, sometimes 5 or 6 in a single afternoon. Men at their stations learned to recognize the distinct growl of engines diving through flak, the way shadows flickered across the sea as planes plummeted. They saw friends torn apart in explosions, yet they also saw their ships survive. Survivors of Formidable remembered the surreal moment when, after dragging wounded comrades below and hosing down fires, they watched as new aircraft were wheeled forward for launch. Life and death alternated with mechanical efficiency, the ship a machine designed to continue the fight no matter the cost in blood. For the Japanese, the psychological strain deepened. Reports from reconnaissance flights confirmed that the British carriers, once struck, resumed operations far too quickly. Pilots returned to their bases, or those who survived escorting missions did, shaken by the futility of watching comrades crash into steel decks that simply refused to give way. Commanders at home knew what this meant. Every suicide strike against the armored carriers weakened Japan not just materially, but spiritually. The very weapon that was meant to inspire fear was instead being blunted into despair. By the summer of 1945, the skies above Japan had thinned to emptiness. The once proud Imperial Navy Air Service, which had launched 6 carriers against Pearl Harbor only 4 years earlier, was effectively gone. The kamikaze strategy had consumed the last reserves of planes, fuel, and men. Where once Japanese skies swarmed with Zeros, now only scattered remnants remained, unable to stem the tide of Allied bombers that roamed unchallenged over the home islands. The Navy itself lay in ruins, its ships either sunk, trapped in harbor, or starved of fuel. The Empire's gamble on human sacrifice had left it defenseless. Yet the British fleet pressed on, day after day, its presence both relentless and symbolic. Every sortie launched from an armored deck reinforced the reality that Japan's last weapon had failed. Every scarred but surviving carrier reminded commanders in Tokyo that courage alone could not stop industrial power wielded with ruthless efficiency. The attrition had been one-sided, and the endgame was in sight. As August 1945 dawned, the carriers of Task Force 57 stood ready for what would have been the final invasion, the assault on Japan itself. But history would take another turn. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, broke Japan's will before the Allied fleets had to launch their final strike. When the surrender came, the armored carriers still bore their scars, each dent and crater a testament to battles endured. They had survived the Kamikaze storm, not through luck, but through design, discipline, and sheer endurance. For Japan, the collapse of its air power was more than a military defeat. It was the end of a national illusion. The belief that sacrifice could overcome material weakness had been shattered against British steel. For the sailors who had endured, the memory of attrition was bitter but clear. The Empire had spent its final weapon, and the skies were empty. The British fleet had proven its resilience beyond doubt. But the question that lingered, even as Japan fell silent, was one that would shape the post-war world. What future of war had been born in those scarred decks and futile dives? The flight deck was still scarred, its steel surface marked by craters hastily patched with bolted plates, the paint blistered by fire. Sailors walked across the uneven metal, boots clanging against the seams, where new steel had been laid down over old wounds. Each dent told a story. The moment a kamikaze had screamed from the sky, the explosion that followed, the chaos of fire and smoke. Yet beneath those scars, the ship endured. It had absorbed the blow and remained in the fight. For the men who lived through it, the deck itself became a symbol, not just of survival, but of a philosophy that had proven stronger than sacrifice. In the aftermath of Okinawa, Allied naval strategists began to weigh what these scars meant. The kamikazes had been Japan's final gamble, an attempt to halt the Allied advance through the will of men willing to die. But against the British carriers, their sacrifice had met a wall of steel. Where Japanese command had wagered everything on the spiritual power of self-destruction, Britain had invested in survivability through industrial design. The result was undeniable. Ships built to endure had triumphed over men sent to die. The armored flight deck became one of the defining lessons of the Pacific War. It proved that a carrier's most important weapon was not only its air group, but its ability to survive the unexpected. The contrast between Britain and America sharpened the point. American carriers, with their vast wooden flight decks, carried more aircraft, launched more sorties, and dealt more damage. But they were vulnerable to catastrophic fires, sometimes forced out of action for months. British carriers, though limited in offensive power, could sustain repeated attacks and continue fighting almost without pause. Each philosophy reflected its nation's resources and geography. America, with unmatched industrial strength, could afford to build in numbers. Britain, pressed to the wall by years of war, needed ships that could endure. In the post-war years, this divergence shaped the future of naval architecture. The U.S. Navy, impressed by the resilience of British designs, moved gradually toward armored flight decks in its supercarriers. By the 1950s, with the construction of the Forrestal class, American carriers featured steel decks as standard, recognizing that survivability was inseparable from striking power. Britain, meanwhile, continued to emphasize armored designs, though its shrinking post-war fleet meant fewer carriers would be built. The lesson of Okinawa, however, endured. No carrier could be expected to survive in combat without armored protection. But the consequences of these design choices went beyond shipyards and naval budgets. They spoke to a deeper truth about the nature of modern war. Japan had gambled on human sacrifice as a weapon, believing that courage could overcome material weakness. It was a belief rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, in the myth of the divine wind that had once saved the islands from Mongol invasion. Yet in 1945 it proved a fatal miscalculation. Industrial power, technology, and engineering had rendered sacrifice obsolete. No amount of human valor could penetrate steel forged in Sheffield or welding perfected in Clyde shipyards. This truth was bitter for Japan to face. Post-war interrogations revealed that many officers had been astonished to learn that their most determined attacks had failed to sink a single British carrier. For men who had sent thousands of young pilots to their deaths, the realization was devastating. What they had presented to their people as decisive weapons had, in practice, been blunted by engineering foresight. The kamikazes had inflicted pain, grief, and loss, but not the crippling victories their leaders promised. The irony was stark. Britain, battered by years of war, rationing, and bombardment, had nonetheless found the resources to invest in survivability. Japan, desperate and cornered, had turned instead to its sons, spending lives as though they were weapons. In that exchange, Britain's steel proved more enduring than Japan's sacrifice. The clash revealed the essence of industrial war in the 20th century. Machines and materials outweighed ideology, and survival was engineered, not willed. For the men who fought, these lessons were personal. British sailors remembered the moment when their ships were struck, the terror of fire spreading across the deck, and the relief when armored plating held. Survivors spoke of watching new aircraft take off from patched sections of deck only hours after a kamikaze hit, the rhythm of battle unbroken. Japanese veterans, in contrast, remembered the faces of friends who never returned, their deaths yielding no visible result. The asymmetry of those memories revealed the larger truth of the war. Sacrifice without effect is tragedy, not strategy. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the armored flight deck had become more than just a feature of ship design. It was a symbol of a new age in naval warfare, where survivability had become as decisive as firepower. The scars across British decks, left by fire and steel, stood as monuments to the power of design choices made years earlier in the quiet of shipyard offices and steel mills. Every crater was proof that Britain's engineers had understood what Japan's admirals had overlooked. Ships must be built to endure, because in modern war, survival itself is victory. Yet the broader consequences extended even further. The failure of the kamikaze strategy revealed the futility of a nation's last gamble when it is rooted in ideology rather than material strength. Japan's leaders had believed that their people's willingness to die could substitute for the loss of resources, oil, and industrial power. The armored flight decks of the British fleet proved otherwise. No matter how many pilots perished, the ships remained, the fleets advanced, and the war was lost. The lesson resonated in the decades that followed. Nations studied the Pacific War and drew their own conclusions. Some invested in armor, others in speed and stealth, but all recognized that survivability was indispensable. The kamikaze, once feared as an unstoppable terror, became instead a case study in the limits of human sacrifice. Courage, discipline, and loyalty mattered, but only when paired with technology that made those virtues effective. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the contrast could not have been starker. On one side, thousands of Japanese pilots had died in flames, their sacrifice spent against steel. On the other, British carriers sailed home with decks scarred but unbroken, living symbols of endurance. Between them lay the gulf between ideology and industry, between sacrifice and survival. And in that gulf, the future of naval warfare was written. The sea was quiet now, long after the war's thunder had faded. A lone veteran stood on the deck of a preserved carrier, his hands resting on the cold steel rail as gulls wheeled overhead. The flight deck beneath his boots bore no craters, no scorch marks, only the echoes of memory. But in his mind, the sounds returned, the shriek of engines diving from the sky, the bone-rattling impact of explosions, the frantic shouts of men rushing to battle stations. He remembered the smoke curling up from burning planes, the heat of flames licking at the deck, and then, almost impossibly, the moment when the ship endured. Time and again, the deck held firm, and life returned to its brutal rhythm of sortie, strike, and survival. The legacy of those armored decks was etched not only in steel but in the lives they preserved. For British sailors, the memory of Okinawa was not simply of horror, but of resilience. They had witnessed comrades torn apart by explosions, carried the wounded below, and shoveled wreckage into the sea. Yet they had also seen their ships continue to fight when logic suggested they should have been destroyed. Survivors spoke of it with quiet pride, that their carriers, though battered, had stood unbroken against the storm of Japan's last weapon. For Japanese veterans, the reflections were more painful. Many who trained pilots or watched friends ascend into the sky never forgot the futility of it. Thousands had been sent to their deaths with promises that their sacrifice would destroy the enemy, only for reports to return that the British ships had survived, launching aircraft even as wreckage smoldered. The image of a burning Zero crumpled on an armored deck became, in hindsight, a metaphor for the collapse of an empire built on illusion. Courage had been abundant, but courage alone could not defeat steel, industry, and foresight. Historians in the decades since have returned to this lesson. The armored flight deck, once controversial for limiting aircraft capacity, proved to be one of the most significant naval design choices of the war. Its success at Okinawa influenced generations of shipbuilding. The United States, recognizing its value, transitioned to armored decks in its post-war supercarriers. Britain, though its empire waned, continued to build ships that bore the scars of its wartime philosophy, endurance above all else. The decision, born of necessity in the late 1930s, echoed through the Cold War and beyond, shaping the very concept of naval power. But the deeper lesson went beyond steel and welding. The Pacific War's final battles revealed the limits of ideology when confronted with industrial modernity. Japan had gambled on sacrifice, believing that the will to die could overcome material weakness. That belief had driven thousands of young men into the sky, convinced they were divine weapons. Yet in the cold arithmetic of war, their deaths achieved little. The armored decks of the British carriers stood as physical proof that engineering could neutralize even the fiercest courage. The Kamikazes had struck with all the force of desperation, but desperation was not enough. The human cost of this miscalculation was staggering. By the war's end, nearly 4,000 kamikaze pilots had died in suicide missions. Their letters home spoke of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Many families received only a photograph and a final note, relics of lives extinguished in moments of fire. For the British, the cost was borne in blood as well. Hundreds of sailors killed or wounded in the attacks. Yet the difference lay in outcomes. The ships survived, missions continued, and the war advanced inexorably toward its conclusion. The armored decks had turned tragedy into survival, while on the Japanese side, tragedy yielded only emptiness. In the years that followed, veterans of both sides struggled with their memories. British sailors carried pride in their endurance, but sorrow for the friends they had lost. Japanese survivors wrestled with guilt, grief, and unanswered questions about the necessity of the sacrifices demanded of them. Some found peace in reflection, others in silence, but the memory of the kamikaze storm remained vivid in their lives. The symbolism of those encounters lingers to this day. A Zero plunging into steel and bursting apart became an image larger than the war itself. It spoke to the transformation of combat in the 20th century, the shift from valor to industry, from individual sacrifice to collective design. It was the collision of two philosophies, resolved not in ideology, but in the stubborn endurance of metal forged far from the battlefield. The Pacific War closed with mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but for those at sea, the defining image remained the scarred decks of carriers that would not yield. It was there, in the meeting of flesh and steel, that the end of Japan's wartime illusions became undeniable. Courage had not been enough. The future belonged to those who built for endurance, who recognized that survival itself was the foundation of victory. Today, as visitors walk the decks of preserved carriers or read the names etched on memorials, they encounter more than history. They step into the echoes of steel, the clang of hammers in shipyards, the roar of engines taking flight, the thunder of bombs striking armor. They are reminded that war is not won by sacrifice alone, but by choices made long before the first shot is fired. The armored deck was such a choice, one that preserved lives, shaped navies, and revealed the brutal logic of modern conflict. In the end, the story of the armored carrier and the kamikaze is not merely about ships and planes. It is about the human struggle between desperation and endurance, between fleeting courage and lasting design. It is about young men who died believing they could change the course of history, and sailors who lived because their ships were built to endure the storm. And as the waves roll on across the Pacific, the memory endures. The image of a burning Zero shattered against a scarred but unbroken deck, a symbol of the truth that defined the war's end. Steel outlasts sacrifice, and the future belongs to those who build for survival.